The city of Acheron was a lie wrapped in neon and cold cement. Detective Elias Thorne knew it better than anyone, having walked its cracked sidewalks and listened to its whispered sins for 15 years. But nothing Acheron had thrown at him. The gang wars, the junkie killings, the sad, mundane domestic disputes. Nothing prepared him for the Northgate precinct. Northgate wasn't just old. It felt buried. A squat, granite block built in the 1920s. It smelled perpetually of stale coffee, industrial-grade disinfectant, and something subtly metallic, like old blood mixed with rain. Elias was transferred here, not for an act of heroism, but a technicality, a necessary piece of bureaucratic shuffling after his partner took a bullet that was meant for him. He was supposed to be running a cold case unit downtown. Instead, he was stuck in the quiet graveyard of a precinct, babysitting paperwork. His new superior, Lieutenant Vivian Holloway, was a woman carved from ice and competence. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and assessing. She gave him the tour, a 5-minute walk through the desolate hallways. "We run lean here, Thorne," Holloway said, her voice low and even. "2 shifts. We handle low-priority calls. The real crime is handled downtown. Your job is simple. Process the drunks, file the missing persons reports, and keep the desk clean. Oh, and the archives. You'll be spending a lot of time in the archives." The archives. The basement of Northgate was a place where light went to die. A warren of concrete cells and filing cabinets that predated photocopiers. It was where old cases, the ones that faded from the city's memory, the ones they gave up on, were sent to molder. "Why the archives?" Elias asked, trying to sound indifferent. Holloway stopped at the stairwell leading down. The air noticeably colder here. It's policy. Every new transfer has to catalog the unassigned boxes from the last 3 years. Apparently, a former desk sergeant had a habit of dumping evidence and files without proper tagging. Paperwork, cleanup. Boring, tedious. But it needs doing. That first night, Elias sat at his steel desk, the only light source a buzzing fluorescent fixture that seemed to mock the darkness outside. The few other officers on a late shift, a silent, hulking patrolman named Cruz and a young, perpetually nervous dispatcher, Sarah, moved like ghosts. There was no banner, no shared laughs, just a rhythmic, unsettling clack-clack-clack of the old teletype machine spitting out mundane reports. Around 1 a.m., Holloway's voice crackled over the PA system. "Thorne. Basement. Now." Elias found Holloway standing next to a stack of 10 battered, unlabeled cardboard boxes. "These are the ones," she said, handing him a thin log book. "We call them the unassigned. You'll work down here from midnight until 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. No interruptions. No radio chatter. Just you and the dust. Any questions?" "Yeah," Elias said, looking at the ominous stack. "What's in them?" "Garbage, mostly," Holloway replied, already turning away. "Old evidence, misplaced files. Things too insignificant to burn. Just tag and shelve detective. And don't lose the logbook." As the heavy metal door to the archives hissed shut, plunging the concrete room into a suffocating silence broken only by the hum of ancient ventilation, Elias opened the first box. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspaper, was not the expected detritus of petty crime. No forgotten wallets or drug paraphernalia. Instead, he found a meticulously organized collection of hand-drawn maps. They weren't maps of Acheron. They were topographical sketches of a vast, remote forest and mountain range that didn't exist in any official registry. What made the hair on Elias's neck stand up were the tiny, precise red circles marking specific locations. Each circle was labeled with a date, and next to the date, a single cryptic, handwritten word. Silence. He picked up the top map. In the center, circled heavily in black, was a location labeled the precipice. As he studied the drawing, the low hum of the ventilation system seemed to drop in pitch, replaced by a sound that made his stomach clench. A faint, almost imperceptible scrape coming from somewhere within the labyrinthine rows of filing cabinets behind him. It sounded like fingernails dragging across steel. Elias slowly reached for the heavy-duty flashlight clipped to his belt, the eerie silence of the Northgate archives suddenly feeling less like a lack of sound and more like a heavy, conscious presence. The first shift had just begun, and the Northgate precinct was beginning to show him its truth. Elias Thorne froze, the beam of his flashlight cutting a sharp, nervous line through the dust motes of the archive air. He strained to hear past the buzzing in his ears. The scrape had stopped. Silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. "Hello," Elias called out, his voice sounding hollow and absurdly loud in the concrete tomb. Only the echo answered. He waited for a full minute, heart pounding an unwelcome rhythm against his ribs. The filing cabinets, taller than any man, stood like rows of silent, steel sentinels. He dismissed it as the building's settling or stray rat, but he didn't believe it. The scrape had sounded too intentional, too close. He forced his focus back to the box of maps. Who made these, and why were they meticulously filed alongside police evidence? He checked the logbook Holloway had given him. The entry for Box 1 simply read, "Unassigned, found in Locker 14. Former desk sergeant's property." Locker 14 was a standard issue evidence locker, now empty. Elias spread several maps on the dusty table. They all depicted the same impossible geography: a high-altitude forest, a river, and a deep, narrow canyon called the Shadow Trench. The red circles, labeled Silence, clustered near the river. He picked up a smaller item tucked beneath the maps, a worn, leather-bound journal, no bigger than his palm. It was unmarked. Elias flipped it open to a random page. The handwriting was a frantic, almost unreadable scrawl. October 14th. The silence is not an absence. It is a presence. It drinks the sound. It took Miller's radio, then his voice. Now, the trees listen. We are deep in the Acheron's vein, where the city's light can't reach. The others are starting to look at me strange. They don't hear the hum. Elias paused. Acheron's vein? Was that the name of this unknown forest? He flipped back to the front of the journal. There was no name, only a date written inside the cover. 2008. The journal was 13 years old. He found an entry that stopped his breath. November 3rd. The precinct knows. I came back. I tried to tell them what we found at the precipice, what the silence did to our senses. They just gave me the paperwork. File it under unassigned. Officer. You've had a difficult night. The chief, he just smiled. A cold, flat smile. I can't leave the evidence here, but I can't keep it at home. It needs to be buried where they won't look. The archives will hold a secret they chilling thought struck Elias. The maps and the journal weren't dumped here by a sloppy sergeant. They were hidden. Just then, the emergency line phone, the one wired directly to the front desk, meant only for direct communication with the lieutenant, rang. The sound was a jarring, insistent intrusion in the stillness. Elias picked up the receiver instantly. Archives, Detective Thorne. He was met with static, thick and buzzing, like a hive of angry insects. "Hello?" Lieutenant Holloway. Then, through the static, a sound emerged. It wasn't a voice. It was a whisper, so faint it could have been the wind, yet it was undeniably human and close. It seemed to come not from the receiver, but from the earpiece itself, directly into his skull. He is listening. He is counting the dead. The voice was raspy, dry, and seemed to belong to someone terrified beyond screaming. "Who is this? Stop playing games," Elias demanded, a sudden cold sweat prickling his forehead. The whisper came again, louder this time, tinged with a horrifying sense of distorted familiarity. The sergeant, he never filed it. He's still here. And then, abruptly, the line went dead, replaced by the flat, empty dial tone. Elias slammed the receiver down. He snatched his service weapon out of the holster, his detective instincts screaming threat assessment. He scanned the rows of cabinets. The basement was supposed to be empty. Cruz, the hulking patrolman, was usually outside on patrol by 1 a.m., and Sarah, the dispatcher, never left her desk upstairs. He stepped out from behind the archive table, flashlight raised, gun pointed into the darkness between the cabinets. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, checking the corners. The beam of his flashlight caught something on the floor near the third row of cabinets. Not dust, not a shadow. It was a single, solitary object. Elias lowered his gun and cautiously approached. Lying there was an old, tarnished sergeant's badge. It looked like it had been dropped or tossed recently. He recognized the shape of the shield instantly. It was a design retired by the Akron PD nearly 20 years ago. He picked it up. It was heavy and cold. Engraved on the back were 3 initials. RCW. Suddenly, the ceiling light directly over him flickered and died, plunging him into absolute blackness. Before his eyes could adjust, the metallic scrape returned, not behind him, but right next to him. And this time, it was followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy, ragged breath being taken in the dark. Less than a foot away, the sergeant, he's still here. What will Elias find when he turns on his flashlight? And how does this tie into the silence described in the journal? The darkness was total, thick, and smelled of ozone and damp metal. Elias didn't need his eyes. His training took over. He spun, flashlight dropping slightly as he brought the muzzle of his Glock up, aiming at the source of the heavy, ragged breath. "Police, drop it. Show me your hands," he roared, the command echoing into the black void. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, a chilling vacuum where sound should be. Elias thumbed the flashlight on. The beam cut through the air, revealing nothing but the stark, unforgiving rows of filing cabinets. He was alone. He checked the floor where the breathing had been. No footprints, no scuff marks, no signs of forced entry or exit. But the feeling of being watched, of something with mass having been standing right beside him, lingered like a chemical burn on his skin. Elias lowered the gun slowly, his heart still slamming in his chest. He checked the badge in his hand again. RCW. He pocketed the evidence, then grabbed his portable radio. "Dispatch, this is Detective Thorne. I need a check on the archive lighting. The main grid just went down in the basement. And run a check on the initials RCW, retired or deceased sergeants." The nervous voice of Sarah, the dispatcher, crackled back almost immediately. 10-4, Detective. Stand by. Wait, Detective. My board shows all green for the archives. No outage reported. Are you sure your local light didn't just blow? It wasn't a local fixture. Sarah. It was a whole damn ceiling grid. Elias insisted, looking up at the dead fluorescent tubes. Run the initials. A long pause followed, filled with a static buzz of the radio. When Sarah returned, her voice was quieter, a little shaky. "Detective, I ran the initials RCW. The system shows a Sergeant Robert C. Wallace. He was assigned in Northgate his entire career. He disappeared in 2008. Official report was missing, presumed deceased. His case file was never closed. It's listed as unassigned cold case 14 2008, the same year written on the mysterious journal, the same year Sergeant Wallace vanished. Locker 14, unassigned box 14. Where was he last seen, Sarah?" Elias pressed, his eyes darting to the corner where the journal and maps lay. Another long silence. Then a slow, deliberate click as Sarah muted her microphone, followed by a muffled, hesitant tone, as if she was talking to someone else. When she finally came back on, her voice was tight and unnatural. "Detective Thorne, Lieutenant Holloway is advising me to tell you that Sergeant Wallace's file is classified, and you are to cease all inquiries immediately. She says you need to focus on the inventory." Elias stared at his radio. Holloway hadn't even come down to check on the supposed power outage. She already knew. She was stonewalling him. He clicked his radio off. He was not going to let a piece of ice-cold bureaucracy stop him. Sergeant Robert C. Wallace was the key to the maps, the journal, and whatever thing had been breathing next to him. He returned to the table and flipped through the journal, stopping at the last complete entry, dated November 4th, 2008. November 4th. "I went to the chief's office tonight. The silence is catching up to me. I see it in the shadows when I blink. I can't leave Akron. It's in my blood now. The chief said there was an incident at the precipice, an unscheduled excavation. He told me the other team members are being transferred out, reassigned to deep, quiet cities. He offered me the same, but I know better. He's going to bury the truth here. He's going to bury me. I'm leaving the journal and the maps in the box. The precinct will hide them. I just pray one day someone finds them before it's too late. before the silence spreads from the forest and takes this place. 2. If you read this, do not trust the captain. Do not trust the lieutenant. Do not stay after 3 a.m. The building is alive. Asterisk Elias checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. 13 minutes until the deadline set by a man who vanished from this very building. He knew he couldn't leave. He had to find out what the precinct had done to Sergeant Wallace. Elias picked up a journal and turned it over. The back cover felt unusually thick. He used the tip of his knife to carefully peel back the leather. Tucked inside, folded tightly, was a small, grainy black and white photograph. IT showed 3 men in hiking gear standing in front of a massive, impossibly smooth, jet-black monolith rising from the floor of a forest. The 3 men were smiling, but their eyes, even in the poor lighting, looked vacant, like the lights had gone out behind them. And on the right of the photo, standing slightly apart from the others, was a younger man with the distinctive, familiar features of Sergeant Robert C. Wallace. He wasn't smiling. His mouth was open in a silent, agonizing scream, and he was pointing a shaking finger directly at the photographer. As Elias looked at the man pointing, he felt the air in the room drop another 10 degrees. The metallic smell intensified, and he heard, quite clearly this time, the rhythmic, soft thump-thump of something heavy dragging itself across the concrete floor, growing closer, and then the sound of the main archive door, the one locked from the outside, beginning to rattle violently in its frame. The photograph, the monolith, and the 3 a.m. deadline. Sergeant Wallace's warning is about to be realized. What happens when the archive door breaks open, and who or what is dragging itself toward Elias? The rattling of the thick, steel archive door intensified, vibrating the very floor beneath Elias's feet. It sounded less like someone trying to open it, and more like something battering itself against the metal. The dragging thump-thump was now right behind the door, wet and heavy, punctuated by strained, guttural noises that were definitely not human. 2:55 a.m. 5 minutes until Wallace's deadline. Elias shoved the journal and the photograph into his tactical vest pocket. He drew his weapon again, training it on the door, his mind racing through the options. Call for backup. Holloway had already stonewalled him. If he called, she'd likely send crews down to contain him, not the threat. Run. There was no other exit. The archive room was a dead end. He backed up until his shoulder blades hit the concrete wall, creating a makeshift firing position. He focused on the only thing he could control, the door. If you come through that door, I will shoot, Elias warned, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The battering stopped instantly. The silence returned, heavy and awful. Only this time, it was broken by a sound Elias hadn't heard before, a deep, wet chuckle that seemed to resonate inside the concrete walls themselves. Then, slowly, deliberately, a single object was slid underneath the gap at the bottom of the door. Elias cautiously approached, keeping his weapon aimed. It was a police utility belt, ripped and frayed, with a heavy-duty flashlight still attached. The flashlight was on, casting a weak, flickering circle of light on the floor. But it was what was next to the belt that made Elias G.A.G. IT was a severed human hand. It was pale and bloated. The fingers curled in a grotesque gesture. Attached to the wrist, half torn away, was a sleeve bearing the familiar dark blue fabric and the gold trim of an Acheron PD uniform. The hand, still twitching faintly, seemed to be pointing at the badge Elias had pocketed earlier. Suddenly, the voice returned. Not the whisper, but a harsh, grinding tone that filled the room, yet somehow seemed to be speaking only inside his head. Look closer, Thorne. Look at what they did to me. Look at what the silence eats. Elias grit his teeth and forced himself to obey. He pulled out the Sergeant RCW badge and examined the hand. As the flickering light of the police flashlight hit the wrist, he saw a scar, deep and distinct. Right above the cuff line, he had seen that exact scar before. In the grainy photograph he just found, the man identified as Sergeant Wallace had a deep, curved scar on his left wrist. The hand belonged to Sergeant Robert C. Wallace, or what was left of him, as this terrifying realization crystallized. The main archive door didn't just open. It was violently imploded inward, ripped off its lower hinge with a sickening shriek of tortured metal. Standing in the frame, blocking the only way out, was a figure that defied description. IT was tall, towering over 6 feet, clad in a shredded and stained Northgate Precinct Sergeant's uniform. But the uniform was draped over a frame that was no longer human. The skin was the color and texture of old, waterlogged parchment, stretched tight over grossly elongated limbs. Its face was the most horrifying part. It was stretched into a permanent, massive, soundless gasp. Its mouth was a cavernous, empty hole, lacking teeth or a tongue, and its eyes were two enormous jet-black reflective surfaces that seemed to absorb all the ambient light. This thing was Sergeant Wallace. Or it was what was left after the silence had claimed him and its left, undamaged hand. It carried a heavy spiked tool, an old trench shovel, the kind used for digging. Elias fired. Twice. The sound of the shots was instantly muffled, choked off as soon as the bullets left the barrel, as if the air itself was too thick to carry the noise. The creature didn't flinch. The bullets impacted its chest, causing two small, wet rips in the uniform, but eliciting no reaction, no blood, no pain. It took a slow, deliberate step into the archives. The sound of its footfalls heavy and wrong. Elias knew standard rounds were useless. He dropped the magazine and slapped in a fresh one, switching his aim to the exposed, parchment-like head. Wallace stopped. Elias yelled, but the sound felt weak and pathetic. The creature didn't stop. It raised the shovel, and in the movement, Elias noticed something deeply disturbing about its torso. Stitched into the front of the shredded uniform, right over the heart, was a crude, misshapen symbol made of dried, darkened material, a terrifying, amateur replica of a Northgate Precinct Badge Point 3:00 a.m. The clock on the wall outside the broken door ticked over to the witching hour. The creature lunged, the trench shovel coming down in a swift, killing arc. Elias threw himself to the side, tumbling behind the main archive table. The shovel slammed into the concrete where he'd been standing, shattering the top of the table and sending with shrapnel flying. He crawled frantically, scrambling to put distance between himself and the terrifying sergeant. He needed to find a weapon that wasn't a standard issue pistol. His eyes scanned the shelves, desperate, landing on a small, sealed box labeled confiscated, case 1971. He grabbed the box, hearing the scraping footsteps of the creature rounding the corner. He ripped the seal open just as the creature stood over him, its gaping, silent maw hovering above. Inside the box was an old, heavy steel riot baton, and tucked beneath it, a small, heavy book bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. Elias grabbed the baton, using his last ounce of strength to swing it up. He didn't aim for the head or the body. He swung directly at the creature's exposed, grasping hand, the one holding the shovel. The impact was a sickening, bone-jarring crack. The creature made no sound, but its grip loosened. The shovel clattered to the floor. Elias scrambled back further, clutching the baton and the strange book, realizing he had temporarily disarmed his attacker. He knew he couldn't beat it. He had to escape. He looked up at the only way out, the gaping hole in the doorway. He had to run past Monster. The steel riot baton has bought Elias a few precious seconds, and he now has the mysterious, confiscated book. Will he make out of the archives alive? And what is the sinister captain doing while Elias faces a monster below? Elias didn't wait for the creature to recover. He scrambled out from behind the shattered table, pushing off with all his might, and sprinted toward the busted archive door. The creature, Sergeant Wallace's animated corpse, shuffled after him, its heavy, dragging footfalls marking its slow, terrifying pursuit. It raised its mangled, broken hand, reaching for Elias's fleeing back. As Elias bolted through the doorway, he glanced back. The thing stopped right at the threshold, its reflective black eyes locked on him, its silent scream frozen in a terrifying rictus. It didn't follow. It seemed unable or unwilling to leave the confines of the archive room. Like a boundary had been crossed, Elias didn't slow down. He hurtled up the cold concrete stairs two at a time, the steel riot baton clutched in one hand and the confiscated book, case 1971, tucked against his chest. The silence of the basement gave way to the slightly less suffocating atmosphere of the ground floor hallway. He burst onto the main floor of the Northgate precinct. The shift had completely changed. The only light was a harsh, blue-white glow of the main fluorescent bars. Dispatcher Sarah was gone. In her place, sitting at the main communications desk, was Lieutenant Holloway. She was calmly sipping coffee, her gaze fixed on Elias. utterly devoid of surprise. "Detective Thorne," Holloway said, her voice flat and even, not even raising an eyebrow at his disheveled state, the sweat pouring down his face or the gun still clenched in his hand. "You're late. What in God's name happened to the archive door?" Elias stumbled up to the desk, panting, the smell of mildew and fear clinging to him. "Lieutenant, it wasn't me. It was a structural failure, Detective." Holloway cut him off, setting her cup down with a sharp clink. "The building is 90 years old and poorly maintained. I've already dispatched a maintenance crew to weld a temporary plate over the door. The archives are now sealed until further notice." "Sealed? You can't seal it. There was a thing down there. It was Sergeant Wallace. And it attacked me." Elias slammed the steel baton onto the desk. "I fired my weapon twice. You didn't hear the shots because that thing is drowning out the sound. You knew about this. The maps, the journal, the unassigned boxes. It was all his evidence, and you buried it." Holloway finally stood, her posture radiating control menace. She walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from Elias. "You need to calm down, Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You spent 5 hours in a dark, cold room, disrupting evidence from 3 decades ago. You're overtired. You fired your weapon at a piece of failed equipment, and now you're fabricating stories about a ghost because you want to transfer back downtown." She leaned closer, her eyes boring into his. "You did not find Sergeant Wallace. Sergeant Wallace vanished. And you, Detective, will write a report stating that the archive door failed due to metal fatigue, and that your weapon was discharged accidentally during a slip and fall. Do you understand?" "No," Elias hissed. "I understand that you, the captain, and whoever else was here in 2008, covered up a murder. No, worse than a murder. You covered up whatever that thing is and let it stay down there. The journal says the precinct knows." Holloway smiled in a small, cold, terrible expression. "You are new here, Detective. You don't understand the rules. The precinct does not serve the city, Thorne. The precinct serves the silence. It keeps the city safe from what lies in the vein. And sometimes, Detective, the cost of that safety is silence." She held out her hand. "Your weapon, your badge, and the materials you unlawfully removed from the archives. Now," Elias hesitated. If he handed over the evidence, he was finished. He'd be written up for psychological evaluation, and the truth would be buried forever beneath the granite of Northgate. But Holloway wasn't alone. From the shadowed back hallway, Cruz, the hulking patrolman, emerged. His massive hands were empty, but his eyes were fixed on Elias with an expression that was neither hostile nor friendly, just utterly, terrifyingly blank. He was standing ready, a silent enforcer. Elias had one card left. He pulled the small, heavy book from his vest. "Before I hand this over, Lieutenant," Elias said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance, "tell me what's in this. Case 1971. Holloway's icy composure finally fractured. Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror crossing her face before she could mask it. She took an involuntary step back, glancing at the book as if it were radioactive. Where did you get that?" Her voice was barely a breath. "It was buried," Elias said, matching her whisper, "in the same box as Wallace's evidence. What is it, Lieutenant? A warning? A history book? Or the actual rule book for keeping the silence contained?" Cruz took a slow, deliberate step toward Elias. Elias didn't wait. He threw the steel baton at Cruz's feet, distracting the large patrolman for a split second, and then he turned and ran for the front door, slamming to the turnstile and out into the cold, dead morning air of Acheron. He was officially a fugitive, running from his own station, clutching the one thing that scared his superiors more than a silent, undead sergeant. Elias didn't know what was in the book, but he knew he couldn't stop. He needed a safe place to read the history of Case 1971. Elias has narrowly escaped the precinct and possesses the mysterious book that terrified Lieutenant Holloway. What secrets does Case 1971 hold? And who is the unseen captain mentioned by Wallace? Elias ran blindly for 2 blocks, the cold air stinging his lungs. He finally dove into the deep shadows between two abandoned warehouses, his mind still reeling from the metallic scent of the archives and the cold terror in Lieutenant Holloway's eyes. He knew he was compromised. His ID and service pistol were still holstered, but he was hunted by his own department. He pulled out his phone, his hand shaking. He had no one. Calling downtown PD would only lead to him being escorted back to Northgate under the pretense of a psychological incident. Elias needed light and privacy. He spotted an all-night diner 3 blocks down, its neon sign flickering tiredly. The last stop. Perfect. Somewhere mundane and public enough to discourage pursuit, but late enough to be nearly emptied. He reached the diner, slid into a corner booth, and ordered the strongest coffee they had, his eyes darting to the entrance. He pulled out the heavy, leather-bound book from Case 1971. The book wasn't a standard police ledger. It was heavier, bound in thick, scarred leather that felt rough against his fingers. The cover was devoid of markings save for the faint impression of a circular seal that had been violently peeled away till he opened it. Inside, the pages were made of thick, high-quality parchment, filled with neat, spidery script written in black ink that looked 30 years old. The top of the first page read, "The Covenant Ledger, Northgate Branch, EST 1971. Project VIN vessel excavation and internal nullification. V.E.I.N. Here remember the journal entry. Acheron's vein. The ledger was not a case file. It was an instructional document, a grim manual for a secret operation." Elias flipped to the index, finding a chilling list of chapters. I. Origins of the Silence, the Monolith. 2. Jurisdiction and Containment Protocol, the Precinct. 3. Personnel. Designation and reassignment, the transfer. 4. Interference and nullification, the failed. Elias skipped ahead to Chapter 2, his fingers tracing the rigid text. The Northgate Precinct was constructed in 1928, not on geological fault lines, but on a null point, a convergence of natural phenomena that weakens the silence's immediate influence. The precinct serves as the anchor. Containment is upheld by ensuring the absolute psychological control of all assigned personnel. Fear of the silence is a necessary component. Questions regarding past operations pre-1971 or the nature of the vein are immediately filed under unassigned cold case, and the inquirer is subjected to Phase 3 reassignment. See Chapter 4. Phase 3 reassignment. That was what happened to Sergeant Wallace. He quickly scanned Chapter 4. Nullification. Interference protocol. Should any officer attempt to expose Project VIN or breach the confidentiality covenant, Phase 3 is enacted. The individual is removed from the roster and physically contained within the Northgate lower sublevel, the archives. The subject will undergo silent integration. Force exposure to the null point for a period of no less than 72 hours, until the subject capacity for auditory and vocal transmission is biologically nullified. Result: the subject becomes a custodian. They are no longer a threat. They serve as a permanent guard of the lower sublevel boundary, incapable of communication, known only by their initials and the sound of their slow, heavy duty on the floor. Elias slammed the book shut, the violent truth of Sergeant Wallace's fate making him sick. Wallace hadn't just died. He had been transformed into the creature below, the ultimate form of being silenced. And Holloway had been protecting this monstrous status quo. He opened the book again, needing to find the final missing piece. The captain, the one Wallace warned him not to trust, he found it in the introduction. Project VIN is administered by the highest-ranking officer of the Northgate Precinct, designated the Anchor Commander, AC. The AC must be a lineal descendant of one of the 1971 founding families, ensuring loyalty to the Covenant. The current AC operates under the guise of Captain. All personnel report to the Captain. Elias looked up from the table, scanning the nearly empty diner. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes, was wiping down the counter. He was alone. He flipped to the back of the ledger, searching for a list of Anchor Commanders. He found on the final page a list of signatures dating back to 1971. The most recent signature, neat and looping, was a current Anchor Commander, AC Designation 04. C.R. Blackwood, assumed command 2005. Elias searched his memory. C.R. Blackwood. The name was familiar. It was the name of the Northgate Precinct captain, The officer whose face was rarely seen, always secluded in the top-floor corner office. The chief Wallace had warned him about. Blackwood wasn't just a captain. He was the head of a secret, generations-old organization keeping the silence contained as Elias absorbed the gravity of this discovery. The diner door opened, and two figures in plain clothes walked in. They were too clean, too sharp for this neighborhood at this hour. They weren't patrol officers. They were internal affairs. Or maybe something worse. They immediately scanned the room, point one of them, a man with a severe haircut, locked eyes with Elias. "Thorne," the man said, his voice carrying the calm, cold authority of a hunter. "Lieutenant Holloway sends her regards. We need you to come with us. We just want to talk about your stress leave." Elias realized he was exposed. The moment he sat down, he'd sealed his fate. He had to run, but he couldn't just keep running. He needed to find a counter-anchor to the precinct's power. He looked back at the ledger, his eyes falling on the Chapter 1 title. Origins of the Silence, the Monolith. The photograph in Sergeant Wallace's pocket, the giant black stone, was the key. He knew where he had to go. Not to the city, but out of it, to the impossible forest described on the maps. He needed to find Acheron's vein. Elias is now on the run from his own department's secret enforcers, and he knows the terrifying truth behind the Northgate precinct. His only hope lies in finding the monolith in Acheron's vein. Elias didn't hesitate. The moment the IA agent, or whatever he was, said the word stress leave, Elias knew this was the end of the line. They weren't there to talk. They were there for Phase 3 reassignment. He kicked the small table over violently, sending coffee, saucers, and a heavy-case 1971 ledger sliding across the linoleum floor with a deafening crash. The diversion was noisy and effective, momentarily stunning the two agents. "Get him!" the severe-haired agent yelled, drawing a non-standard issue black handgun. It wasn't police model. Elias was already moving. He vaulted over the back of the booth and smashed through the emergency exit door, which led directly into a narrow, filthy alleyway. The sounds of breaking glass and shouting men faded instantly as he plunged into pre-dawn gloom. He ran until his lungs burned, discarding his police jacket in a dumpster, hoping to shed his recognizable uniform. He reached the main thoroughfare and flagged down a battered taxi, throwing himself into the back seat. Union Station. "Don't ask questions." "Double the fare," Elias gasped, peeling off $200 in cash. He needed to get off the grid, and he needed transportation to the remote area described in the maps. Union Station was chaos, the perfect place to disappear. Inside the rattling taxi, Elias pulled out Sergeant Wallace's journal and the hand-drawn maps. The police were looking for a frantic man running away from the precinct. He was going to run towards the source. The maps were topographical, highly detailed, but contained no recognizable landmarks or compass bearings, only the names, Shadow Trench, the precipice, and the cryptic Acheron's vein. Elias flipped through Wallace's journal again, searching for any geographic references. On the last page, Wallace had scratched a barely visible note in the margin. They tracked the vein by the star shift. The precinct is built on the intersection. Northgate latitude must align with the monolith shadow at the autumnal equinox, the Blackwood Line. The Blackwood Line. The name of the captain, C.R. Blackwood, was tied to the location of the silence. This wasn't about conventional maps. It was about astronomical coordinates. Elias reached Union Station, paid the driver, and headed straight for the oldest part of the building. The faded grand hall with the towering antique clock and the enormous star-themed mural on the ceiling. He found a secluded public computer booth, pulled out his last $20 bill, and started searching. He wasn't looking for Acheron's vein. He was looking for Blackwood Line. He typed in Acheron PD Blackwood Line, combining the official and the secret. The search returned nothing. He tried a different tack. 1928 Acheron Construction Celestial Coordinates. That yielded a breakthrough. A digitized copy of an old, obscure architectural paper from 1931 discussing geomanic alignment in municipal structures. It mentioned the construction of a Northgate precinct. The structure rests on coordinates aligning with significant but unnamed geological anomaly 150 miles northwest of the city, in the remote Canyon River region. The architects followed a design principle called the Quiet Star Alignment, dictated by the property owners. ensuring the precinct exact latitude mirrors the anomalies Canyon River region. Northwest, 150 miles. Elias finally had a location. He quickly cross-referenced the topographical features on Wallace's map with a detailed geological survey of the Canyon River region. The shadow trench on Wallace's map matched a feature called the Sinking Canyon. The precipice matched a peak known locally and largely unvisited, as the Sentinel's Tooth at Acheron's Vein was the local name for the entire forest and canyon system. Elias checked his watch. 6:30 a.m. He had a few hours before the city woke up, and his face was plastered on a bolo. Be on the lookout. Report. He used a computer to book a one-way bus ticket to the last small town adjacent to the Canyon River region, a place called Oakhaven. He paid in cash at the counter as he walked toward the bus bay. Elias felt a strange, cold dread settle over him. He was trading the stone prison of the precinct for the silent, vast prison of the wilderness. He was leaving the world of bureaucracy and police procedure and stepping into the secret world of the Covenant Ledger. Before boarding, he pulled out his service weapon and badge one last time, looking at his reflection in the polished brass. He couldn't risk being stopped by a routine patrol. He slipped the gun into his backpack, keeping the steel riot baton from the archives. He tossed the badge into a garbage bin. Detective Elias Thorne was gone. He boarded the bus. As the vehicle pulled away from the station, Elias looked out the window. Across the street, standing in the shadows of a building, was Patrolman Cruz. The hulking officer was completely still, his eyes fixed on the bus. Cruz made no move to follow. He simply stood, a dark silhouette, watching Elias leave the city. IT wasn't a threat. It was a confirmation. They hadn't failed to catch him. They had simply decided that Elias was no longer their problem. They were letting him go to the silence. Elias is now on a bus heading towards a remote location of the monolith, leaving the controlled terror of the precinct for the unknown horrors of Acheron's Vein. Why did Cruz let him go? The bus ride to Oakhaven was a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. Elias spent the 6 hours clutching the Case 1971 ledger, reviewing Sergeant Wallace's maps and the gruesome implications of Phase 3 reassignment. The fact that Cruz, the silent enforcer, had let him walk away was the most chilling detail. They weren't hunting him down. They were guiding him toward the source. The precinct wanted him to find the monolith. But why? Oakhaven was a tiny, faded town clinging to the edge of civilization. It was a place where people either retired or simply got stuck. The only thing of note was a sheer, menacing wall of dark forest that began abruptly just beyond the last street sign. This was the fringe of the Canyon River region, Acheron's Vein. Elias rented a beat-up pickup truck for cash from a greasy, indifferent mechanic. He bought minimal supplies, food, water, a heavy coat, and a durable hiking compass. The moment he drove out of Oakhaven, the world changed. The road quickly turned from paved asphalt to rough, overgrown dirt. The air, which had been crisp and clean, began to carry an unnatural density, a heavy, almost magnetic atmosphere. He drove for another hour, relying entirely on Wallace's map, which detailed geological formations far more accurately than his standard road atlas. He turned onto a barely visible track marked by a faded, rusted sign that read, "Danger! Private property! Keep out!" He parked the truck deep within the trees, covering it with thick canvas he'd bought. He pulled out his backpack and the essentials, the journal, the maps, and the heavy steel riot baton, a crude but effective weapon. He felt naked without his gun, but the risk of being caught with it outweighed the potential defense as he stepped out of the truck and into the forest. Elias noticed the first profound anomaly. The silence. IT wasn't the natural silence of a deep woods, filled with the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, or the call of birds. This was an active, oppressive nullification of sound. It was as if every living thing within this boundary had its volume turned to zero. He consciously stomped his boot on the forest floor. The sound was flat, dead, absorbed instantly. He clapped his hands sharply. The echo was choked off before it could bounce off the trees. The silence described in the ledger was real, and it was disorienting. Elias consulted the map. He needed to follow the course of the Canyon River toward the interior, eventually reaching the Shadow Trench. The journey was difficult. The ground was rocky and uneven, and the trees were massive, ancient pines that blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight. The deeper he walked, the more disoriented he became. The absolute silence played tricks on his mind, making him believe he heard whispers just at the edge of his hearing, with a heavy, dragging thump on the custodian right behind him. He stopped at a small, moss-covered clearing to check his bearings. He pulled out the map and the compass. That's when he noticed a second chilling anomaly. His hiking compass, a reliable liquid-filled model, was spinning wildly, completely unable to find magnetic north. It wasn't just inaccurate. It was broken by some powerful, localized force, the null point. The ledger's reference to a geological anomaly. The monolith was disrupting the Earth's natural magnetism. Elias was now navigating blind, relying solely on Wallace's hand-drawn, non-traditional maps and his own instincts. He pressed on, following what he believed to be the path of the river, when he came across a clearing that wasn't on the map. It was a wide, muddy circle, and in the center stood a single, bizarre object. A metal tripod about 5 feet high, made of rusted iron pipes. But the tripod wasn't supporting a camera or survey instrument. Dangling from the center was a thick, braided rope, frayed at the end, hanging directly over a patch of freshly dug earth. Elias approached cautiously. The mud around the tripod was trampled by numerous boots. This was a recent disturbance. He looked down at the earth. It had been dug up and then filled back in, but poorly. Something had been buried here, and recently exhumed as he scanned the perimeter of the clearing. He spotted something caught on a low-hanging pine branch. It was a small scrap of dark blue fabric, the same specific shade as the Northgate precinct uniform. They had been here. Holloway's people. They had come to the vein to dig something up. Elias looked at the frayed rope end dangling from the tripod. It looked suspiciously like a crude noose. He slowly moved toward the center of the fresh mound. He knelt down, running his hand through the loose soil, and his fingers brushed against something hard and cold. He dug quickly, scraping away the dirt. It wasn't bone. It wasn't metal. It was a piece of rock, smooth and unnaturally black. Elias quickly pulled out the photograph from Wallace's journal. The grainy picture of the 3 men standing in front of colossal black stone. He compared the rock fragment in his hand to the picture. It was a perfect match. Elias was holding a chip from a monolith. He suddenly understood why Holloway had let him leave. They weren't guiding him to the monolith to silence him. They had been there, and they had taken something. Now, they wanted him to follow the trail, perhaps to retrieve something for them, or perhaps simply confront what they had unleashed. As Elias stood up, gripping the fragment, the eerie silence of the vein was shattered. Not by a natural sound, but by a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive, high-pitched whine of a powerful electric drill coming from deep within the woods, followed by the faint but unmistakable sound of metal striking stone. Someone was at the monolith, and they were drilling into it. Elias has found a fragment of the monolith, and the people from Northgate are currently engaged in some destructive operation in the vein. What is the monolith, and why are they drilling into it? Elias moved quickly and silently through the deepening twilight of the vein, the sounds of the drilling and metal scraping acting as an unnatural beacon. He kept low, using the massive, silent pines as cover. The monolith had to be nearby, likely at the precipice, the location circled most heavily on Wallace's map. The terrain became steep and rocky, confirming he was approaching the high ground. He finally reached a ridge and cautiously peered over. Below him, nestled in a vast, bowl-shaped clearing, was the scene of the operation. IT was exactly as Wallace's photograph depicted, but infinitely larger and more terrifying in person. Rising from the earth was a colossal, jet-black stone slab, the monolith. It was impossibly smooth, lacking the texture of any known terrestrial rock, and absorbed the dim light, making it seem like a hole torn in reality. It hummed with a low, inaudible vibration that Elias could feel in his teeth. Around the base of the monolith, for figures in dark, non-uniform tactical gear were working. They had set up powerful portable generators, floodlights, and heavy industrial equipment. Elias recognized Cruz, the hulking patrolman, standing guard with a long-barrel rifle, his face impassive. Another man was operating a high-powered diamond-tipped core drill, pressing it against the base of the monolith. The Lieutenant Holloway was directing the operation. She was no longer the ice-cold bureaucrat. She was a focused, ruthless commander, Elias scanned the clearing, searching for final key player. Captain C.R. Blackwood. He spotted him standing slightly apart, near a command tent. Captain Blackwood was a severe, thin man, dressed in a pristine field jacket, looking utterly out of place in the grime. In his hand, he held a delicate audio recorder aimed at the monolith, logging the sounds of the drill. The precinct serves a silence. Elias realized a chilling irony. They were destroying the silence to achieve some goal. The man operating the drill pulled back, wiping sweat from his brow. He had successfully bored a deep hole into the monolith. "Captain," he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the silenced air. "Core is ready for extraction." Blackwood nodded, stepping forward. "Lieutenant, initiate the retrieval protocol." Holloway went to a large metallic box, likely a specially shielded container, and prepared the retrieval tool, a long, thin grapple with insulated handles. Elias instinctively knew he couldn't let them take whatever was inside. If the monolith was a container for the silence, then drilling into it was an act of calculated catastrophe. He carefully pulled out Wallace's journal. On the page describing the precipice, there was a tiny annotated sketch, a small, precise diagram showing an internal energy flow within the stone and an external weakness, a small, naturally occurring fissure located high up near the top that channeled the nullification field. Elias looked at the monolith. High up on its smooth surface, near the peak, he spotted a hairline crack. It wasn't a null point. It was a control valve. If he could disrupt that fissure, he might destabilize the creature containment, or at least create a violent, distracting surge of energy. He had to get closer. He slipped the riot baton from his pack and began a silent, agonizingly slow descent down the ridge toward the operation site. As he closed the distance, the drilling team succeeded in extracting the core. It was a perfect, cylindrical plug of the black stone. They placed it gingerly into the shielded box. "Excellent," Captain Blackwood said, his voice clipped and triumphant. "We now possess the means to modulate the null point. The city council will be most pleased. We won't need the precinct as an anchor much longer." Holloway looked worried. "Captain, the ledger warns against extracting the stone. It could trigger an immediate vein collapse." "Nonsense, Lieutenant," Blackwood scoffed. "Superstition from the 1971 architects. The world evolves. We control the silence now. We don't just contain it." He turned to Cruz. "Sweep the area, Patrolman. We pack up in 5 minutes." Cruz began his slow, methodical patrol of the perimeter, heading directly toward Elias's position. Elias knew he had seconds. He broke cover, scrambling up a boulder and sprinting directly toward the monolith, ignoring the shouts of the drilling crew. "Stop him," Holloway screamed. Cruz snapped his rifle up, aiming at Elias. Elias didn't stop. He pulled the steel riot baton from his belt, and with a desperate, two-handed swing, he slammed the heavy, blunt end of the baton into the hairline fissure at the top of the monolith. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The monolith didn't shatter. It sang as sound erupted, not an audible wave, but a deep, vibrating hum that bypassed the ears and punched directly into the skull, a sound full of raw, terrifying presence. The air turned frigid, and the specialized floodlights around the perimeter exploded in showers of sparks. The ground began to shake violently. The drilling rig toppled over. Captain Blackwood screamed, a high, thin sound of absolute terror, as the monolith began to pulse with faint, internal black light. Cruz, aiming his rifle, suddenly lowered his head and squeezed his eyes shut. A thin stream of blood began to leak from his ears. He dropped the rifle and clawed frantically at his uniform, his body beginning to convulse violently. Holloway stumbled backward, staring in horror at Elias. "You fool! You released it." The tremor intensified. Elias realized his reckless act hadn't solved anything. It had merely started the countdown. The silence was fighting back. From the fissure where Elias struck the stone, a thick, coiling plume of black, oily smoke began to pour out, instantly absorbing all light and color, and heading straight for the terrified Captain Blackwood. Elias has accidentally triggered a catastrophic event, revealing the true danger of the monolith. What is the black smoke, and how will Elias use this chaos to escape Blackwood and Holloway? The deep, resonating hum emanating from the fractured monolith intensified, a sound of cosmic, silent rage. The black, oily smoke, the essence of the silence, did not dissipate. It coalesced, forming a swirling vortex aimed directly at Captain Blackwood. Blackwood, frozen in horror, dropped his audio recorder. Before he could utter a sound, the smoke enveloped him completely. There was no scream, no struggle, just a sudden, terrifying collapse of his pristine field jacket onto the ground, now empty. Blackwood was gone, absorbed by the silence. The remaining men in tactical gear were in a panic, their training shattered by the impossible horror. They dropped their tools and scattered, running blindly into the dark woods. Cruz, the former custodian in waiting, was still convulsing, his body beginning to contort in unnatural ways, his ears bleeding profusely. He was being violently nullified by the unfiltered energy of the ruptured monolith. Elias, despite the ringing agony in his own ears, grabbed the steel baton and rolled behind a large boulder, pulling the case 1971 ledger close. The geological structure of the vein was collapsing. This was the vein collapse Holloway had warned about. Lieutenant Holloway, however, was not running. She stood near the shielded box containing the extracted core, her face a mask of furious determination, staring at the black vortex where her captain had just been. "You idiot! You just proved him right!" she shrieked at Elias, her voice thin and ragged. "He wanted to control it. We had it contained." Elias scrambled up, using the boulder for cover. Containment meant turning people into mute zombies like Wallace. You let that thing live in your basement. That custodian kept the door shut. Holloway fired back, pulling a small, silver pistol, not standard issue, from her belt. The precinct is a necessary evil. This thing is what created the city, Thorn. The silence is the price of Acheron's existence. She fired. The shot was loud and shockingly clear in the disrupted silence, signaling that the nullification field was breaking down. The bullet slammed into the boulder inches from Elias's head. He didn't fire back with his service pistol, still in his backpack. He used his one advantage, knowledge. Wallace's journal says the monolith takes the senses. It takes the sound. Why did Blackwood want the core? To weaponize the silence, not control it. He didn't want to save the city. He wanted to control the anchor. Holloway flinched, her resolve momentarily cracking. He lied. He said he was going to reinforce the city's perimeter. He was going to replace the precinct. That ledger says a captain is the lineal descendant. Blackwood wasn't doing this for the city. He was consolidating his family's power over the null point. Elias shouted, pointing to the empty spot where Blackwood stood. "He didn't make it. Now you're the last one." Holloway looked down at the black smoke swirling over Blackwood's clothes, then back at the shielded box containing the core. She made a decision. She rushed to the box, grabbing it and hefting its surprising weight. If the anchor commander is dead, the protocol must be enforced. I have to get this back to the precinct. It's the only way to reestablish the null point. You'll destroy the city trying to force that back in, Elias yelled. But Holloway was already sprinting up the ridge, disappearing into chaotic, collapsing forest. Elias ignored the fleeing lieutenant. He looked at the monolith, now actively leaking the black essence, and then at the convulsing body of Cruz. The transformation was accelerating. Cruz's bones were visibly shifting, his uniform ripping as his frame elongated, his mouth stretching into familiar, soundless gasp of custodian. Elias had seconds. He rushed over to the now abandoned command tent. He needed one thing, Blackwood's audio recorder. He found it dropped on the ground. He snatched it up, noting that the record light was still blinking. Blackwood had been recording the entire operation, the whole terrifying truth of the Covenant ledger and the vein collapse. This was the evidence that could expose Northgate forever. He heard a high-pitched, metallic shriek, the final sound of the monolith fully rupturing. The ground bucked violently, throwing Elias off his feet. He looked back at the monolith. The black substance was pouring out, not swirling anymore, but spreading out like a dark, expanding fog. It was heading toward the path leading back to Oakhaven. Elias had a choice: chase Holloway in the core, or run for his life with the evidence. He chose the evidence. Holloway was heading back to the precinct. The anchor, that was the final battlefield. He turned and plunged into the opposite side of the forest. The only thought driving him now, he had to use Blackwood's final recording to destroy the precinct and the Covenant Ledger's grip on the city before Holloway could stabilize the collapse. Elias is now racing Lieutenant Holloway back to the precinct, the anchor, with the recorded evidence of the monolith's power. Holloway possesses a dangerous core, intending to close the rupture she now believes Elias caused. Elias ran for his life, the monolith's silent energy driving him forward. The woods were no longer still. They were alive with the sound of snapping branches and collapsing earth. As the vein collapse accelerated, the black fog of the silence was spreading rapidly, chasing him out of the remote Canyon River region. He eventually stumbled back to his rental truck. His ears were ringing, but his mind was clear. He had the key, Captain Blackwood's audio recorder. The drive back to Akron was a desperate race against time. Elias knew Holloway was faster. She likely had a pre-staged escape vehicle and the institutional support to navigate the back roads. If she made it to the precinct first and successfully used the monolith core, the consequences would be citywide. He arrived back in Akron just as the sun was beginning to rise. The city looked normal, but an uncanny atmosphere hung over it. A low, persistent hum that Elias, now attuned to the silence, could sense rather than hear. It was the sound of the null point destabilizing. He drove directly to the Northgate precinct, realizing his only option was to use the building's infrastructure against itself. He found the precinct in chaos. Patrol cars were parked haphazardly, their radios spitting static. Officers were running in and out, their faces pale and confused. The atmosphere felt wrong. Too much movement, too much noise, yet underneath it all, the hum was growing. Elias bypassed the main entrance, remembering a neglected ventilation shaft near the basement archives. He found the hatch and, using the steel riot batten, forced the rusty bolts. He slid down the dark chute, landing near the secondary entrance to the archives. The archives door, which Holloway had promised to seal, was now fully open, the metal twisted and scorched from the monolith's explosion of energy. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy metallic scent of custodian. Elias cautiously entered the archive room. Sergeant Wallace's transformed body, the custodian, was gone. The room was empty, save for the debris and the shattered table. Holloway had retrieved her custodian and brought it upstairs. Elias raced up the stairs to the main floor. Lieutenant Holloway was standing at the dispatch desk, the shielded box containing the monolith core sitting next to the primary communications panel. She was attempting to use the precinct's ancient, oversized radio system. "This is Northgate. We have a code black, 2 containment failure. Need immediate support from the city grid. We are activating the anchor's backup subfield generator." Holloway was shouting into the mic, her desperation palpable. Elias stepped out of the shadows. "Stop, Holloway. That subfield generator isn't a backup. It's what the Ledger calls the final protocol. It'll kill everyone within a mile, turning them into a new null point." Holloway spun around, the silver pistol now leveled at Elias. Her eyes were wide with a fierce, manic belief. "You don't understand, Thorne. The silence is reaching the city. That noise you hear? It's the sound of the veil tearing. If I don't stabilize the anchor, Akron becomes a graveyard of the soundless. And if you succeed, you become the new captain, the new anchor commander. You'll bury the truth and continue the custodian program." Elias countered, holding up Blackwood's audio recorder. "I have Blackwood's final words on this. I have the whole truth of the Covenant Ledger." Holloway laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Audio? That's what you think will stop this? Your civilian court won't touch this, Thorne. The silence is already here." She raised a pistol, aiming for his head. Elias didn't wait for her to fire. He threw the case 1971 ledger, the physical symbol of her oath, directly at her face. Holloway instinctively ducked, the silver pistol discharging a shot that harmlessly struck the ceiling. As she stumbled back, Elias lunged toward the dispatch panel. He grabbed a heavy, shielded core box. It was cold, pulsing with latent energy. He knew he couldn't put the core back in the monolith. That was Blackwood's mistake. He had to destroy the core's ability to be modulated by the precinct. The precinct is the anchor. Holloway, I'm taking out the damn anchor. Elias yelled. He slammed the core box down onto the communications panel, twisting and ripping wires. He needed a surge of raw, destructive power. He looked at the massive, old-fashioned fuse box on the wall, the one that controlled the main power for the entire building, including the mysterious subfield generator. No! Holloway screamed, charging at him, dropping her gun to tackle him at that moment. The door to the captain's office burst open, not by Holloway's men, but by Sergeant Wallace. The custodian was a terrifying sight. His large, elongated frame was now completely silent in its movements. He held his rusty trench shovel, his massive, gaping mouth stretched in a silent, accusatory scream, focused entirely on Holloway, the last representative of the Covenant that imprisoned him. Wallace didn't attack Elias. He stalked past him, his focus single-minded. He swung the shovel with impossible, silent force, slamming into Holloway's ribs as she reached for Elias. Holloway cried out, not in sound, but in a horrific, internal gasp, dropping the core box and clutching her shattered side. Elias had his window. He lunged to the fuse box, ripping the cover off. With the steel riot baton, he smashed the main line, crossing the central power cables. The result was a blinding, deafening arc of electricity that slammed into the core box and the communications panel. The entire Northgate precinct went dark, plunging the central office into chaos. The hum stopped. The silence was gone, replaced by a deep, ringing nothingness. Elias felt the immense, magnetic pull of the null point shut down. The anchor was destroyed. When the last sparks faded, Elias looked up. The custodian, Sergeant Wallace, stood motionless over the prone body of Lieutenant Holloway. The black smoke of the silence that had been swirling around was gone, drawn back into the inert core box. Wallace slowly turned his head toward Elias. His eyes, the two black, reflective pools, seemed to focus on the man who had freed him. Then, with an unnerving finality, the custodian simply collapsed, his unnaturally rigid body falling to the floor, finally dead. The silence was absolute, but it felt right this time. The silence of true, hard-earned peace. Elias destroyed the anchor, ended the Covenant, and freed Sergeant Wallace. The horrifying truth of the Northgate precinct is over, but the evidence remains. The final, blinding surge of electricity destroyed the physical anchor of the Northgate precinct. When Elias's vision returned, the building was shrouded in silent, oppressive darkness. The custodian, Sergeant Wallace, lay still. Lieutenant Holloway was alive but seriously injured, curled around the inert, shielded box containing the monolith core. Elias, despite the agony in his ears, didn't check their pulses. He knew the threat was over, at least within the walls of Northgate. He scrambled for Captain Blackwood's audio recorder, ensuring the recording was intact. This was the proof that the Acheron PD had been running a secret, murderous cult for decades, maintaining the silence by sacrificing or transforming its own personnel. He walked out of the ruined precinct at 5 a.m. The building was a blackened husk, its granite facade now cracked and stained. The other officers, dazed and confused by the power outage and the bizarre events, were milling about, having witnessed a sudden, violent end of the vein collapse. Elias didn't report to anyone. He knew the cover-up would begin instantly. The moment the city woke up, the precinct would activate its emergency protocols. Instead, Elias drove straight to the Acheron City Hall. The exposure, he walked into the city council chambers, found a cleaning crew setting up, and used the public address system. He plugged Blackwood's recorder into the main audio input and pressed play. The recording was horrifying. Blackwood's clipped, arrogant voice detailing Project Vienne, the null point, the creation of the custodians, and his final panic screams as the silence consumed him. Elias let the chilling narrative play for an hour before he was finally apprehended by federal marshals. Not the Acheron PD. He had bypassed the corrupted local police and gone straight to the one authority that couldn't ignore the tape, the public record. The aftermath of fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Northgate Precinct was condemned and immediately seized by federal agencies. Holloway, who miraculously survived, was arrested and charged with multiple counts of conspiracy, abuse of office, and accessory to murder, Phase 3 reassignment. She never spoke a word in court, maintaining the code of silence to the end. The Case 1971 ledger and the monolith core were seized and classified under the highest level of national security. The official story became a toxic materials leak at an abandoned chemical plant, Acheron's vein, and the Northgate officers were casualties of a widespread psychological operation gone wrong. Elias Thorne, after extensive debriefing, was given a full pardon and classified as a material witness to a federal crime. His official record was wiped clean of the psychological incident claim. The new silence Elias never returned to police work. He moved to a small, quiet coastal town thousands of miles from Acheron. He carried 2 constant reminders of the Northgate precinct, the steel riot baton and the hand-drawn maps of Acheron's vein, which he kept hidden. Sometimes, late at night, when the sea was calm, Elias would hold a riot baton and listen to the world. He realized the vein collapse hadn't truly destroyed the silence. It had merely scattered it. Acheron, the city, was left without its anchor. Its constant, deep hum of unnerving silence was gone, but the city was now marked by a growing number of peculiar, small anomalies, sudden, unexplained bouts of temporary deafness, radios that permanently broadcast static, and strange, hushed areas where sound simply died. Elias understood the warning in Wallace's journal. The silence is not an absence. It is a presence. The Covenant